I pledge my allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I pledge allegiance to the Bible, God's holy word, and will hide its word in my heart, that I may not sin against God. We are doing a series right now, U.S. history from a New Testament perspective. This is Matt Singleton with Bible Smack Ministries. We're going to talk about American prehistory, everything kind of building up into our identity of what America is. This is not it's extensive secular history. I'm not a professional historian, so keep that in mind. That's not what I'm going for. I'm going for just an interpretation of some of these things. There's been some good resources out there. When we talk about America's history, a lot of people, a famous guy is David Barton with Wall Builders. You can go look him up on the old internet. And he'll basically provide you a lot of good information talking about America's Christian history. And that's very good. But the perspective is going to be a little bit more kind of theocratic. Another guy you look at is Eric John Phelps. And he really kind of talks about the dark history of Roman Catholicism, and that's very important in understanding the development of Western history. There have been some historians who are usually associated with a Presbyterian philosopher, Gordon Clark, that also kind of do the same thing. But one of a disciple of Eric John Phelps and Gordon Clark's, a contemporary of mine, is a guy named Rick Shelton. He's done some really good research, although his presuppositions, one is that he came from Presbyterian and later turned to Messianic Jew, and the other thing, he thinks of race, he calls himself a racialist. I don't see a division in races. I believe that we're all made from the same blood of Adam and stuff like that. So essentially, I want to get the heck away from that. But he's got some real good research on his issues and stuff. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of have a perspective that kind of goes across the board. I'm at a point in my life where I'm not able to really fully devote myself to this, but if I do put something in writing, I will put the research and get the scholarship all there and get the references and everything worked out. So that's kind of where I'm going. You might notice I kind of did the, we usually call it the VBS pledge, Vacation Bible School. You pledge allegiance to the flag, and then you pledge allegiance to the Bible. Now, one thing I didn't do was I didn't pledge allegiance to the Christian flag. The Christian flag, I'm okay with doing at VBS because we are working together with different denominations and inviting all the children to come to this church for this event. But basically, when we're looking at American history, I do not pledge my allegiance to Christendom. Because sometimes Christendom has been Christendom. And God wanted His bride holy and separate. And so, with that understanding of a people that's set apart and not the same as the world system, that's been the New Testament church throughout the centuries, and I want to help people understand and illustrate those principles. Now, when we're dealing with the concept of America, I want to go back and look at some of the early stages. Obviously, people think about the Native Americans, the first people to settle this land, and what do we get out of them? Well, we don't get the claims of Mormonism. You don't have the secret Lamanites and all this kind of stuff, or Jesus coming down to America or anything weird like that. They're not related to the Jews. But what you get is you get traditional tribalism. Tribalism really kind of goes back to God's covenant with Noah, and the religion of Noah at that time spread throughout all the people groups of the world, because all the people groups of the world came from Noah. And eventually they got tainted through the teachings of Babylon. The people who were at the Tower of Babel corrupted the religion of God and corrupted our knowledge of the stars, came up with a satanic interpretation that we see today in astrology. With this misinterpretation, you start to develop pantheism and stuff. But when you look at the roots of these old religions, you will find a lot of similarities to the Bible. You do not find any history that's succinct. And when I mean succinct, I mean generation after generation. You don't see that going past 5,000 years. Genesis and the Bible will show you 6,000 years. But the rest of history cannot go that far. They will also have stories of giants. They will have stories of a great flood that wiped out the earth. The high God, the spirit of the sky, different things like that. In the Bible, it talks about a long day, 2 days long, in the book of Joshua. Well, in North and South America, you have legends of a long night, because it was the other side of the world. So, there's just some many confirmations, but also an inversion of paganism and different, lifestyles that were not always successful. I don't want to focus on the Native Americans. I have some Native American ancestry, but basically, needless to say, I do want to emphasize that their society was not a very strong society. Sometimes they did have some freaky things, just depending on which tribe. So I don't want to bland them all. I don't want to bunch them all together or anything like that. But, there were times where they'd eat their horses, or they'd have human sacrifice and polygamy and different kind of issues and stuff like that just were not successful. Also there was an issue of population. They were not a massive population for the size of the continent. They were really a small population that kind of went around from one place to another and just kind of chilled out, pretty much. But, except, depending on the warring tribes and stuff like that. Well, anyhow, you have some characters leading up to American history out in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire. What you see happening is, of course, everybody knows about Constantine. When he took over the Roman Empire, he instituted Christianity as a state religion. The Christianity of the Bible was not the state religion. You got to remember, in the Bible, they wanted Jesus to become an emperor and ruler himself. And they said, we'll take it by force. And he stopped them. And then when he was up in front of Pontius Pilate, what did he tell him? He said, my kingdom's not of this world, otherwise my servants would come and fight for me. So basically, New Testament Christianity is different than the Christendom, the Holy Roman Empire. And this merger of Christianity with the Roman Empire turned into Roman Catholicism. There's a lot of different key points. Obviously, this brief survey. But one thing is that basically after the Roman Empire started falling apart, people started to bind together and, with the works of Augustine and some other people, really start to have more empire power into the religion as opposed to just the secular empire. And that way you could outlast different rulers. Well, then you had a French king named Pepin, and basically the Bishop of Rome received a revelation. He said that St. Peter came down and he wrote this great scroll that was in gold handwriting. And he said that the Apostle Peter had come down from heaven and had told him that things need to be right, that the Pope had inherited the Roman Empire, and this is where we see the Vatican establishing itself, and Pepin was so impressed by this golden scroll that he abided by it, and they said that basically the Pope would rule the Roman Empire by the donations of Constantine. Around 700 to 1000 AD, they went from the question of whether or not you could pray to an icon or worship icons, switching over by 1000 AD to say it's mandatory of all the churches. Okay, so not only was it, whether I can worship an image, to you have to worship an image. About the time of 1100 AD, they had something called the Albigense Crusade. You see, the Roman Empire had its external enemies in Islam. And Islam, I believe, has a lot of ties, and part of its creation came out of Rome. You'll find many things, the empire religion and stuff like that. There is a good expose on it with Alberto Rivera and Jack Chick in a comic book known as, it was a Crusaders comic book, but it was, the exact volume was called The Prophet, and it talks about that. But regardless, basically, they had this external enemy in Islam. Then they had their internal enemies, because Rome had authority in their religion. They had this religious authority, and that was great, because not only could you argue about somebody going to jail, but you could take them to hell. Okay? So you wielded this theological power over these people. And how would they take it? Well, they had to make sure that they were the only dominant religion. And in order to make sure they were the only dominant religion, they made the reading of the Bible illegal. In fact, many times priests and even bishops were illiterate because they never used the Bible. They would preach, some of the priests would preach out of the Latin version. They didn't really have anybody knowing the original languages of the Bible. They would use their icons and stained glass windows and oral traditions and stuff like that to keep on talking about the Gospels. But, the priest was the holy man, and only he knew the sacred traditions and the sacred liturgies and worship, and he controlled the sacraments. And so basically that's how they kept their power. As a result, they were more of an illiterate society. Now, the Jewish society was always looked at suspiciously because the Jews knew the law and they were illiterate people. They always had books. And since they always had books and writing, they were always better educated than their neighbors. Because until the 1800s, you did not see a mass literacy for the public. And when you didn't have that mass literacy, or we'll say like the term freedom of press, when you didn't have the freedom of press, guess what? Everything in society did not flourish. It just went downhill. But it's okay for those who are ruling, the people who are rich. And they may be able to carry some of their personal technology. The rich would have better access to knowledge and stuff like that. But you would have this class of people known as the serfs. And the serfs just did not have access to any of that. And most of the time they were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to own weapons. They were controlled. They were not allowed to, have a different religion. Okay? And that's where the Inquisition came in. We mostly think about it as the Spanish Inquisition, because Spain was the biggest empire at the time. It took over half of Europe, not to mention South America and other parts of the world. Okay, so we're talking about a massive empire. But basically, whether it was Spain or France and later England, you had this thing where the Inquisition was under place. It wasn't just the Kingdom of Spain. And what it was a way of controlling people. Well, there was always Christians who would keep Bibles, maybe not full Bibles. They keep whatever they could find. Okay, and you see this today in China. I mean, if they got a Bible, to keep it, but sometimes they just don't have access. And so basically, there was a people though who were a people of the book, and they would hide away. One group that's most famous is the Waldenses. Okay, that's with a W. But they were the people of the valleys in Sweden, and the Piedmont Valley and stuff like that. And basically, because they were in these deep valleys in the mountains, they were hidden away from the rest of society. And so generally, I mean, they weren't absolutely secret. Okay, people knew of them, but they really, it was a waste of time to go and bug them. And so basically the gospel would be preserved through the Waldense people, these people of the valleys. Okay? Now, they would keep Christianity going. But this other Christendom, this Holy Roman Empire of Catholicism, it was a place where it was an empire religion, and the empire ruled. And when you didn't have free speech, your technology didn't go very far. Your education didn't go very far. There wasn't literacy. And that's why they call it, what do they call it? They call it the Dark Ages. Okay? So then, you would have these outsiders in different groups. But one thing they had was they called the Albigense Crusade. And that was when they focused the Crusades and the wars on the people in France, the people in Switzerland, and all these people who were hiding out and stuff like that, and basically trying to just get rid of them. Okay, to kind of illustrate how many people we're talking about, one fella, Alberto Rivera said it was like 69 million people over a 1,500-year period. Another fella, he kind of noted over a 500-year period, it was 500 million. So most of it was kind of concentrated. Okay, 50 million, excuse me. But 50 million people over a 500-year period. And so basically, we talk in the past about different minorities and what they've had to suffer. People will talk about what the Jews suffered. People will talk about what the African Americans have suffered. But this group of people was basically equivalent to today's white Baptists or white Protestants. And essentially, they would get mutilated, they would get tortured, they would have all sorts of horrific things. One scene I saw was where they had this girl, they put glass on a rope and cloth, and they would force her to swallow the cloth by putting water in. They would use these little torture devices. And basically, they would have her swallow the glass and then kind of rip it out so the blood is pouring everywhere. A lot of the methods of the Inquisition would be the inspiration for the Nazi Holocaust. The Nazi Holocaust had a lot of people who had known about these methods, and what they did was they used modern technology to amp it up, okay, and so that they could efficiently, kill off such a large population and stuff. So there's a lot of torture, a lot of mutilation, people getting slaughtered, and just on a massive scale. And a lot of it is just hidden away right now. I mean, people just, that's not the first thing that you're thinking about, okay? I don't think we ought to bear grudges as Christians and stuff, but at the same time, this is the memory of these people. And, even a lot of your preachers, even your Protestant preachers, just have no clue of what was really going on and what has been done. And basically, all this stuff was over having a Bible. During the 1500s, there was a time where they would kill parents and children, specifically if they found their kids reciting the Lord's Prayer in English. Okay? And there's many of these different groups who would fight, but the Reformation starts in the 1500s, and basically the difference is that these guys are inside the system, they're inside the schools. And, Martin Luther is the preacher, he's the theologian of the town, okay? And he was able to get political protection. So was John Calvin. They were able to get political protection, and that's the big difference among the Protestants to the New Testament Christian / Anabaptist, okay? But the Anabaptist movement is kind of both a little bit of the Waldense movement. You see similar theology. They live in similar towns. I mean, it's going on in Switzerland again, right? But basically, at this point, these Anabaptists are thinking about? They're thinking about, making a new society. And they're wondering if they can get the peasants to rise up and rebel. And that didn't work because the peasants didn't have weapons. So basically the technology was down and they just weren't able to make any dent or make any difference. But the Anabaptists would get together and they would talk about ideas. In their own churches they had congregations, they had free churches and stuff like that. But they also talked about, what about society? Maybe we can have a democratic society. In a lot of ways what we see in the modern Tea Party movement, that's kind of what was going on with the Anabaptists. And so basically they wanted freedom, they wanted liberty, and they believed that their God had given them freedom, given them liberty, that they had a right to have access to the Word of God. And today when you talk to a Romanist, they will say that's the most horrible thing about it. They'd say, well, there's all these different opinions. People have choices and free thinking, and one guy says this and one guy says that, and how do you know? And it's like, how do I exist without having somebody tell me what to do on every single issue? Today we'd call it growing up. Today it'd be responsible. Oh no, I'm responsible and I learned something, so I just take care of it myself. Yes, that's true. This society in this way will actually make you responsible. It'll make you have to educate yourself and to know these things and be discipled and be a strong person instead of a weak-willed serf. So basically, the New Testament Christian is freedom-loving and basically, at the same time, kind of holy and set apart. The empire wants to take over, and there are just different buttings of heads. You had the Anglican Church, which is really, it's kind of like a Lutheran church. It's also a state church. It just kind of got dismembered. It doesn't really alter a whole lot. It alters its theology a little bit, but tries to stick with the same system. So they're very, very close to Catholicism, also an empire religion. Eventually what they've done is they've become liberal. And why not? Because for them it's all about the politics. Okay? That's why today's Anglicans are among the most liberal Christians around, because they're just a political entity more than they are a theological group. Well, anyhow, with America, you're going to find the first two colonies, Jamestown, will be Anglican. The Massachusetts Bay Area colony, that's going to be Puritan. Okay, and the Puritans are going to be those who are followers of Calvin. They did not want to be radical like the New Testament Christians. They wanted to have their political peace. And they were, similar to a lot of today's conservatives. And basically, what they wanted was they wanted to reform the empire. Okay? So they wanted to make a more biblical Catholicism. But it's not totally. Okay? It's going to have to mix these elements. So they're going to keep infant baptism, because infant baptism ties you to citizenship and it ties you to the empire. Okay? And so basically, how did they do that? Well, they would confuse the church with Israel. They would think of themselves as the new Israel. And as the new Israel, they would be more open to more top-down government. Not nearly as excessive as the Holy Roman Empire, mind you. But there will be this mixing of the law with the New Testament, and it's part of their covenant theology. So basically that's what you're going to have there. You're going to have this political Christianity in Virginia, and then you're going to have this legalistic form of Christianity. And I'm not against the more legalistic form of Christianity so much, but there are going to be stories and examples where you'll see the contradictions and you'll see how this is all turning out. And I guess, when we kind of see with the Native Americans, it'll be an issue to where, because of their societies not having literacy. Now, the Puritans and the New Testament Christians read their Bibles. We have to read, you have to have literacy. Then you also have to have traditional families. When you have traditional families, then you produce a lot of kids, but you're able to take care of them. And then you grow up and you get to more family systems, and the family systems take care of things so that the government doesn't have to. Then the church takes care of things so the government doesn't have to. So you have several institutions making up for the government, as opposed to what we see in communism and this early serf system. Okay, so that'll be enough for this installment of American history from a New Testament perspective.